Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn about Stafford County's other prominent Revolutionary War figure named William Washington. I'm Eric Anderson, Adult Services Librarian at the Hal Branch Library, and it's my pleasure to present this Lunch and Learn today. So, first off, let's start by addressing the main question people usually have when they first learn about William Washington. How's he related to George? Everybody's heard of George Washington, but William is unfortunately relegated to mostly military history circles, which is a shame because his actions during the war significantly contributed to the eventual American victory. Anyway, his relation to George is that he was a second cousin once removed, as you can see on this handy family tree that I made. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on to William. William Washington was born on the 28th of February, 1752, in Stafford County, Virginia, at Windsor Forest, his family's 1,200-acre plantation. Unfortunately, the house he grew up in no longer exists, but we know it was located on what is now Marine Corps Base Quantico. Like other children of his social standing, he received a good education, learning to read and write, and taking part in more leisurely activities such as riding and hunting. His education and equestrian pursuits would prove beneficial later in life, as we will soon see. Before the Revolution, he studied theology, intending to become a minister. And on the right there, you can see a quiet church, which is one of the churches that he attended. And if you're familiar with Stafford, you'll know that that's a historic landmark here. When war broke out in 1775, Washington's desire to join the ministry was overshadowed by his patriotic zeal. He helped raise a company of Minutemen from Stafford County and was subsequently elected the unit's captain on September 12, 1775. The following winter, he received a captain's commission in the 3rd Virginia Continental Infantry Regiment. The 3rd Virginia spent the next several months training and guarding Virginia's coast from the forces of its recently deposed governor, Lord Dunmore, who was stubbornly trying to reclaim the state for the crown with a combined force of Loyalists and British regulars. Interestingly, the picture of the musket you see here was a musket produced by the Virginia State Gun Factory. The factory supplied Virginia troops with arms during the war and just happened to be located in Fredericksburg. It was located somewhat ironically on what is now Dunmore Road. There was a historical marker of the spot, but unfortunately it has been recently been reported missing. Anyway, Dunmore's forces actually conducted a raid here in Stafford County. If you're interested in learning about that event, it will be covered in another presentation next year at the Hal Branch called Historic Aquia Creek. It will be presented by Geraldine L.B. McGregor of the Stafford County Historical Society and will be held on Saturday, May 9th from 11 to 12. Now back to William Washington. After Lord Dunmore's forces were defeated at the Battle of Gwynn's Island in July 1776, the 3rd Virginia was ordered north to New York in support of the Continental Army. They arrived in mid-September on the heels of a disastrous American defeat at Long Island. Several days later, on September 18th, the Continental Army made a stand against Major General William Howe's pursuing forces at Harlem Heights. Here, Washington and the 3rd Virginia proved their mettle, trading volleys with the British and refusing to give ground. The engagement marked the first time that the Continentals held their own against the British in open battle and provided a much-needed morale boost for the Americans. The next clash between the British and American forces came on October 28th at White Plains. This battle left an indelible impression on Washington and provided him with a valuable lesson on the importance of cavalry. At the time, the Continental Army lacked a substantial mounted arm, so when British dragoons charged the American right flank, there was no equivalent force to check their onslaught. The militia on the American right disintegrated into a panicked retreat. Fortunately for the Americans, the British had received a considerable number of casualties earlier in the battle and did not press their advantage, leaving the Americans to retreat in good order. And on the left here, you can see a battle map of the Battle of White Plains. And on the right, you can see a contemporary depiction of a cavalryman of the 17th Light Dragoons, which is the unit that charged the Continental Army at White Plains. So after the defeat at White Plains, the Continental Army, including the 3rd Virginia, conducted a slow and miserable retreat through New Jersey. The weather was harsh, supplies were low, and many soldiers lacked proper clothing. They finally halted in Pennsylvania near McConkey's Ferry. In late December, Captain Washington would again play a role in keeping the American cause alive. On the night and early morning of December 25th to 26th, he, along with his second-in-command, future president, Lieutenant James Monroe, led a scouting party across the Delaware River in advance of the rest of General Washington's main force, which made its famous crossing later that night. Once the army was across, Washington's unit acted as advance guard to Major General Nathaniel Greene's column. In the ensuing battle, the famous Battle of Trenton, Washington distinguished himself by leading his men in a charge to capture Hessian artillery. Monroe later described the daring action of his captain during the battle, saying, "Captain Washington moved forward with the vanguard in front, attacking the enemy's picket, shot down the commanding officer, and drove it before him. Rushed forward, attacked and put the troops around the cannon to flight, and took possession of them." Both Monroe and Washington were wounded during the attack, Washington in both hands, Monroe with a serious wound to the chest. William Washington can be seen with his wounds in former Continental Army soldier turned artist John Trumbull's painting, The Capture of the Hessians at Trenton, December 26, 1776, as you can see in these depictions here. As a reward for his and the Third's meritorious service, the 3rd Virginia was given the honor of escorting the Hessian prisoners to Philadelphia. Washington was further rewarded for his actions on January 27, 1777, when he was promoted to major in the recently organized 4th Continental Dragoons. For the rest of 1777 and most of 1778, Washington was kept busy recruiting men, procuring supplies, skirmishing with the British, and apprehending deserters. Then, in the early autumn of 1778, events transpired that would allow Washington to utilize his energy, skill, and bravery even further. On September 26th, another dragoon regiment, the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, were ambushed in the middle of the night at Old Tappan, New Jersey, by 4 battalions of British infantry. It was a bloody affair, conducted mostly with bayonets, and it left the 3rd crippled, with its commander, Colonel George Baylor, wounded and taken prisoner. Those who were fortunate enough to escape with their lives were now in need of a leader, and General Washington wisely decided that his able cousin was just the man for the job. William Washington marched the dispirited and shaken band of less than 100 troopers, most now bereft of mounts, to Frederick and Hagerstown, Maryland, for winter quarters in late November. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and officially given command of the 3rd Dragoons. And on the right, you can see the uniform of the 3rd Dragoons. And on the right, on the left, you can see the uniform of the 3rd Dragoons. On the right, you can see a surviving example of a Continental Dragoon saber. By 1779, the war in the North had reached somewhat of a stalemate, and the British had begun to set their hopes for victory in the South, where they had gained a foothold in Savannah, Georgia. In early December, the 3rd were ordered south in less than ideal conditions. A troop was left behind to act as George Washington's bodyguard, and more than a third rode on inferior mounts. So they marched south under strength and under-equipped. Washington and the 3rd arrived outside Charleston, South Carolina in February 1780. It was here that Washington met his future bride, Jane Elliott, when encamped near Sandy Hill, her family's plantation. Her father was a local patriot, and it is thought that Washington may have gone there to alert the Elliots to the presence of British raiding parties. Whatever the circumstances, there was an immediate rapport between young Jane and the cavalryman who had appeared at her doorstep. She is said to have declared that she would look out for news of his flag and fortune, to which Washington regretfully replied that his regiment lacked any such flag. The spirited Miss Elliot promptly took action, cutting a strip of cloth from her own crimson drapes and fashioning it into a pennant. She enthusiastically proclaimed, "Take this, Colonel, and make it your standard." The flag would serve the Third until war's end, and it survives to this day in the possession of South Carolina's Washington Light Infantry, a military fraternal organization, who continue to proudly display the relic on special occasions. Several weeks later, Washington first encountered Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, commander of a loyalist unit called the British Legion. Tarleton would prove to be a formidable foe, with whom Washington would engage in a deadly game of cat and mouse over the next several months. So, on the left, you can see the flag that Miss Elliot made for Washington being displayed by the Washington Light Infantry. And on the right is a portrait of Bannister Tarleton. Washington's first encounter with Tarleton came on March 27th, when he ambushed Colonel John Hamilton's Royal North Carolina Regiment, taking a number of prisoners, including the colonel himself. Tarleton's cavalry rode to the scene and attempted a rescue. An officer with the 1st Dragoons remembered that Colonel Washington, with his regiment and Vanniers, faced about and charged the enemy, and after a few minutes the enemy retreated with the loss of 20 killed, wounded, and taken. He had 3 men wounded, 1 very bad, the others slightly. Washington's command then successfully withdrew. In April, as the British army besieged Charleston, Washington's command did not fare quite so well against Tarleton. On the morning of the 14th, Tarleton's dragoons hit Washington's camp at Monk's Corner, cutting down or capturing many of the 3rd Dragoons. Washington was captured early on in the engagement, but managed to slip away in the ensuing chaos. This debacle was soon followed by a similar and equally humiliating defeat at Leonard's Ferry, where Tarleton once again caught the Continental cavalry off guard, this time with their backs to the Santee River. 30 Continentals were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and even more horses were captured. Washington and Colonel Anthony White, who had recently superseded Washington as commander of American cavalry in the Southern Army, managed to escape by swimming across the Santee River. So on the left, you can see a tableau of Tarleton's cavalry at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And on the right is the Santee River. Washington retreated to Wilmington, North Carolina, with some 75 horseless dragoons to rebuild his broken regiment. He ran into difficulties procuring funds, but eventually persevered in returning the 3rd Dragoons to fighting order by October. In the meantime, much had occurred during his absence from the Southern theater, none of it reassuring. After the fall of Charleston, on May 12th, Major General Horatio Gates took command of the Southern Department on July 25th. On August 16th, however, American forces were routed by Major General Lord Cornwallis at Camden, South Carolina. When the 3rd Dragoons once again took the field, joined the remnants of Gates' force, it was attached to an elite unit of light infantry under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. Morgan soon recognized Washington's abilities as a cavalry commander and sent him and his men to capture a Tory stronghold in South Carolina known as Rudgley's Mill. Washington found the position to be strongly fortified, yet he was not one to back away from a challenge. Thinking quickly, he had his men assemble a mock cannon out of a pine log burnt black and disassembled wagon. Upon seeing the supposed gun, the post commander quickly capitulated. A few days preceding this engagement, Major General Nathaniel Greene had replaced Gates as commander of the Southern Army in Charlotte, North Carolina. He devised a daring plan which involved dividing his army in two, sending Morgan's troops into western North Carolina to forage and threaten Cornwallis' left, while the rest of the army would go east, where supplies were more abundant. Recognizing the threat that Morgan's force posed, Cornwallis sent Tarleton and a force of roughly 1,200 infantry and cavalry to subdue him. On January 17, 1781, the two forces met in an area known as the Cowpens, with the broad river several miles to the Americans' rear. The situation was ominously similar to the early defeats at Monk's Corner and Leonard's Ferry. This time, however, the Americans would not be caught off guard. Morgan had learned of Tarleton's tactics from the militia, which had joined him in droves. It is likely that Washington also briefed him on the subject. Morgan therefore adjusted his battle plan accordingly. And on the left, you can see a portrait of Morgan, and on the right is a battle map of the Battle of Cowpens. So during Cowpens, Washington's force of dragoons and mounted militia played an important role in the ensuing engagement, checking and repelling charges by the 17th Light Dragoons and British Legion Dragoons, and at a pivotal moment, charging and breaking Tarleton's infantry. Tarleton tried to mount a countercharge, but was only able to gather about 50 of his men, his most dedicated troopers, to make the assault. The rest flat out refused to make such a foolhardy attack. Predictably, his attack failed, and his party wheeled about to join their already fleeing comrades. Amongst the chaos, Washington noticed a party of 3 British cavalry officers lagging behind and seized upon the opportunity to bag a few high-profile prisoners. He charged head-on towards the little group, outpacing his men who raced to catch up. Upon seeing Washington galloping towards them, unsupported, the three British officers rushed forward to slay their audacious pursuer. Luckily for Washington, several of his men caught up with him in time to rescue their imperiled leader. A member of the aforementioned British party was in the process of bringing his blade down upon Washington when one of his sergeants rode up and slashed him with his saber. A second blade was about to land on Washington when his young attendant shot its wielder. Washington then closed with the third officer, parrying a lunge directed at him. His attack repulsed, the third assailant rode off a short distance, turned, and shot Washington's horse. This third officer is said to have been none other than Tarleton himself. And while Tarleton made no mention of this event in his memoir, several other witnesses attest to it. There are also rumors of Washington having lopped off one of Tarleton's fingers, but these are unsubstantiated. Washington and his dragoons pursued Tarleton and the remnants of his command for some 20 miles, but failed to overtake their quarry. And this is a 19th century painting of the duel between Washington and Tarleton. After the battle, Greene and Morgan's forces reconvened at Beatty's Ford, North Carolina. Cornwallis pursued them with his main army. However, Greene, whose plan was not to engage but rather weaken Cornwallis's army through attrition, managed to retreat across the Dan River into the safety of Virginia. At the end of February, Greene marched his army back into North Carolina, where Washington's cavalry constantly skirmished with the enemy. The armies of Greene and Cornwallis finally faced off on March 15th at Guilford Courthouse, where Washington adeptly commanded a corps made up of cavalry, infantry, and riflemen. When the British foot guards forced a wedge in Greene's center, Washington led a charge that cut them to pieces. Despite this success, however, the Americans were eventually compelled to withdraw. Yet, Guilford Courthouse was a Pyrrhic victory for Cornwallis, as his army suffered grievous casualties. Greene later praised Washington's conduct during the battle, noting that the horse, at different times in the course of the day, performed wonders. Indeed, the horse is our greatest safeguard, and without them, the militia could not keep the field in this country. After Guilford Courthouse, Greene shadowed Cornwallis's army as it marched to Wilmington for supplies. He soon perceived, however, that with Cornwallis heading towards Wilmington, the numerous British forts in South Carolina were ripe for the picking. Greene's forces quickly captured several British outposts across the state, while Cornwallis opted to ignore Greene's army and went north to ravage Virginia, which he considered more strategically significant. During this period, Washington and his men attacked and disrupted British lines of supply and communication. Although Cornwallis had moved his army to Virginia, he had left behind a substantial number of troops to garrison the various forts and cities in the Carolinas. In August, Greene engaged a large force of these troops at Eutaw Springs, about 50 miles from Charleston. On September 8th, Washington commanded Greene's reserves, made up of his cavalry and 2 companies of Delaware infantry. The battle furiously ebbed and flowed, but eventually went in favor of the Continentals, who drove back the British center and left with a furious advance. However, a battalion of light infantry and grenadiers on the British right, well situated among thick woods, refused to budge. Greene ordered Washington forward to eliminate this threat. As Washington's cavalry surged forward, the British met them with a deadly volley. An eyewitness said that Washington jumped his horse into the midst of the enemy, but his mount was shot, pinning him to the ground. The same witness further recounted that a British soldier, appearing to be in the posture of attempting to stab Colonel Washington, one of his men rushed forward and cut him down in one blow. Nevertheless, Washington received a bayonet wound to the chest and was taken prisoner. Washington's imprisonment proved more fortuitous than it did harsh. He was treated well by his British counterparts and taken to Charleston, where he was nursed back to health by none other than his erstwhile admirer, Jane Elliott. The couple was married on April 17, 1782, while Washington was still on parole. Through this union, he not only gained a wife, but also a valuable plantation. After the war, Washington flourished in his role as a planter. He went on to serve in South Carolina's legislature and donated his salary to the poor of his local parish. He spent the remainder of his days in the comfort of his plantation and his summer house in Charleston, surrounded by his family, until passing away in 1810. He was survived by his wife, son, and daughter. And this is actually his summer house that still exists today in Charleston. Washington's actions during the Revolutionary War proved invaluable to the American cause. As an infantry officer, his courage and sound leadership were an asset to the fledgling Continental Army. As a cavalry officer, he provided the forces of the Southern Department with a reliable, highly effective mounted wing. His dragoons proved their worth time and time again at Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, Hobkirk's Hill, and countless other skirmishes and forays. What is perhaps Washington's highest commendation came from the lips of an old adversary, when Lord Cornwallis stated that there could be no more formidable an antagonist in a charge at the head of his cavalry than Colonel William Washington. That concludes our today's Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.